my channel, The Inked Reader. Today I have no pins because I actually, by mistake, last time on my TBR for March, I showed you a pin that I had already shown you. So I'm kind of, this is my punishment. I'm not allowed any pin today. I try not to show the same pin twice, but yeah, it's just, no, I'm kidding, I'm not punishing myself, but I'm between lessons. As always, I'm running around and I didn't have time to choose one and go through my videos and decide which one I've not showed you yet. So I'll try to do that next time. Apologies, no pins. So I'm here today to do my wrap-up for February. I'll go through some quick statistics before I start. And first of all, I have to admit February was way worse than January. Unfortunately, I think this February and March are really intense months for university. Got a lot of essays, a lot of lessons, and I felt that. So my reading kind of suffered for that. And of my 10 books on my TBR, I managed to read 7, still not too bad. I read a total of 8 things, 7 were physical books and 1 was an audiobook. Usually, again, I listen to way more audiobooks, but I didn't have time to do stuff around the house or anything else, so I didn't have time to listen, basically. With the 7 physical books, I ended up reading 1,831 pages. And in terms of years that the books came out, 1 book was between the 1900 and 2000, 6 books were between 2000 and 2020, and 0 new releases for 2021. Unfortunately, I didn't get around to read what I wanted to, which was a new release, but it's in my TBR for this month, so hopefully I got time. Finger crossed. And I've read 5 books by male authors and 3 books by female authors. As I said, of my TBR, I've completed 7 of the challenges, and you can watch my TBR for March to see which books I'm gonna carry over. For targets, I read 1 YA and 7 adult books, and for ratings, 1 book was in the range of 2 stars, 2 books were in the range of 3 stars, and 4 books were in the range of 4 stars, and 1 book I've not given any rating to. And the last category is genres. I've read 4 non-fiction, 1 horror, and in the fantasy category, which is divided by subcategories, you can watch my video here to see what I mean by subcategories of fantasy. 1 was a portal fantasy, 1 was sci-fi, and 1 was assassin fantasy. So without further ado, let's get into the books. So I've actually started the month by reading The Blue Abyss by Jane Sido, which is a made-up name, and this is the book for my DV memoir diary format that I'm doing. DV stands for domestic violence. This is about this woman who married as a second marriage, this police officer who got transferred to this small town where he was kind of chief, or he was definitely in charge, and pretty soon after the marriage he becomes very abusive. So Jane, I call her Jane in this case, she's very worried about her life, and this is her story on how she escapes him and what happens to her. This is very short. I've done a review for this in my DV memoir, which I'll link up here. Unfortunately, in February I had to put out 2 of those videos. I tend to stick to 1 a month, so apologies if in February I had to put up twice because I was catching up from January. But this is the 3rd installment in the series, and I go in a bit more details there. I do not give these any ratings, and if I have to just summarize these very shortly, it gave me an insight into domestic violence that's perpetrated by law enforcement officers, which was a definitely new subgenre of domestic violence that I was not familiar with, but there was some issue with the narration of this. But again, you can watch the video. Then I read my true crime selection for the month, which was Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grun. And first of all, in my TBR, I said there was a movie which I would go and watch. There is no movie. I made that up. I don't know why. I thought this looked like Christian Bale. I don't know why. It's not him. And a movie, I think it's coming out for potentially soon. So there's no movie for me to watch. This takes place in Osage County in the 1920s, and Osage County is this area in Oklahoma where basically native Indians were relegated by white men, so they were sent off there against their will at the beginning. They kind of settled down, build their houses and all of that, and all of a sudden they found that the soil is rich in oil, and from, you know, being outcasted and in poverty, all of a sudden they become very rich because they can sell the oil. So that's the premise. And then this kind of kicks off when a series of murders start to happen. So these native Indian Americans are starting to be killed off, and there is this idea that there is a serial killer on the loose. So what is nowadays the FBI, but back then it wasn't yet, they send an agent to kind of investigate, and there is him and a bunch of other agents under him that try to kind of get pieces together to find out what is going on. They kind of focus on this conspiracy theory on how these people are getting killed in order for other people to get rich, and it's very difficult to describe without spoiling anything, but I'm just gonna leave it at that. I found this very fascinating. It was well written. The only pity is that because this took place so many years ago, a lot of informations are actually lost, so we get an idea what happened. Like, I think the author did an amazing job in putting together research and facts, but there are still a lot of questions that are unanswered. There are also a lot of names that are mentioned, dozens and dozens of names, which I got kind of confused at one point. I couldn't recognize who was who died and all of that, so I struggled with that a little bit. But I really appreciate that there are pictures inside this, so I love when there are pictures, especially in true crime and all of that, because otherwise I just have to Google them. And this is called The Birth of the FBI. I'd say it's a kind of a stretch. It's not really too focused on the FBI, but however, there are a lot of politics in this. So I think it's a good introduction, but I would not read these just to learn the story of FBI. I think you would need another book for that. I ended up giving these 4 stars. Again, true crime is something that I read very quickly. I really enjoyed. I found very fascinating. And then I have finally finished, for my finishing series, ending series TBR, I read Dark Dawn by J. Christoph. This was my pick for actually January. I didn't get around to finish this in January. I finished this in February. And this is the final installment in the Nevernight Chronicles. Nevernight, the first book, it's about Mia Corvere. Her parents get murdered and she's rescued and raised by an assassin who then send her off to this assassin school, where her main goal will always be to avenge her parents. Try to review this without giving any spoilers. I have to say that first of all, there is a character that I cannot stand, and unfortunately has been like that since the second book. In the first book, I don't even remember her. I'm talking about Ashlyn, and then if you know Ashlyn, you know why there are aspects of this book that I kind of don't like just because of her involvement, and I was just not on board with that. I could never get around to like that character. So, said that, there is also half of this book I was very shocked because of how much I was finding kind of cringy, in the sense that they were honestly just screwing each other for like half of the book, and it was just like I was reading an erotica book, and every speech was about sex, and they were just so horny all the time. And although I like sex scenes in fantasy sometimes, the amount of them and the amount of talk about sex, I was like, wait, I came in this book for this brutal, awesome murder story, and now I've got these. So I was not very pleased with the amount that it was, not considering the characters that I didn't like. So it was just a bad match, basically. And then there is a murder that happens, and I loved that scene. And then after that kind of picks up, there is a lot of more action, a lot of more blood, which is what I signed up for. So the second half definitely saved this book. One of my favorite characters is actually Trick, and his fate, what happens to him and what the author does with him, didn't make me very happy. Like, I thought he deserved so much more. I ended up liking this overall. I gave it 4 stars. The action was always brutal and amazing. I loved Mia in the first book, and then kind of went downhill. But overall, I'm happy I finished this. It was a nice journey, and I cannot wait to actually read this next one. I just wished he had integrated the sex scenes a bit differently in the beginning. Then for my only audiobook, I listened to Wayward by Blake Crouch, and this is the second book in a trilogy. I believe it's just a trilogy, and this is called the Pine trilogy, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a kind of sci-fi. I categorize this as sci-fi. And there is also another genre I could say, but I think it's a spoiler, so I'm not gonna say that. In the first book, you got our protagonist, Ethan. Ethan wakes up after a car accident. So he's an FBI agent or CIA agent, I don't remember, one of the two. He wakes up in this small town after this car accident. His memories are wiped clean, and he needs to figure out where he is, who he is, how he ended up there, and all of that. The first book is a lot of murder mystery for, I would say, a good half of it and I absolutely loved it, and the twists were amazing. In this one, I kind of went in expecting something that kind of was what it was, and I wished they had surprised me more. So I'd say that I enjoyed this tiny bit less. However, it's still brutal, it's still very fast paced. I really listened to this very quickly and the twists are still good overall. So I ended up giving this 3.75 stars, but by no means is a bad rating. I think it's definitely a trilogy. I mean, the third book will decide the overall enjoyment of the series, but it's a series that definitely deserve more love. Maybe it's loved, I've never heard of it. But then I have read Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. This is my non-fiction choice for the month, and this is my second Gladwell book. I love the guy from the first book, and I absolutely love his writing style. I love everything about this man. Like, I think he's a genius. But anyway, this book in particular, he talks about when we make very quick judgments about things, kind of the instinct judgments that sometimes we make. He takes as an example when someone recognized a statue that was at the Metropolitan Museum as a fake. They just looked at it and said this is a fake, while other people, thousands of experts, had seen it and thought it was original. That's just to give you an example. So he discusses what happens in our brain, why we do make sometimes these kind of quick judgments and why sometimes they are right, but also discusses the other side of the coin. So why sometimes we make these judgments and they are very wrong and cause a lot of distress and problems. It goes into criminal justice, and it goes into the shootings that the police have perpetrated against black men, for example. They were unarmed and absolutely innocent. So we discussed both, and I have to say that compared to the other book that I've read by him, which was Talking with Strangers, some of the things he discussed, especially in the first half, and some of his examples just clicked a bit less. I mean, they were just less interesting. Said that, I still loved all of it. I gave this 4.5 stars though. I really love how he can explain very complex psychology theories and how it works, how your brain works sometimes, and how it goes into sociology and all of that, and he does that in a very digestible manner. Again, then it's up to kind of you, especially if you are in the field, to kind of go and delve more into his research or what he's saying, because I'm not saying that everything he says is gold. I personally really like his approach, and I kind of tend to agree with the majority of things he says. But I think it definitely gives you, and that's why I love him so much, it gives you a lot of hints and starts a discussion that you can then delve into on your own, in your own time, and you can kind of delve deeper into them and getting to know more. So it gives you the ideas and then you can develop them basically. So I really enjoyed that, and 4.5 stars. I will read everything this man has ever put out, and it's just so fascinating, so fascinating. Then I have read In an Absent Dream by Shannon McGuire. This was my pick for my fantasy TBR, and this in particular covered the portal fantasy. These are companion books. So the premise of this series is that you got different children come into this boarding school after they've traveled through portals to fantasy worlds. Each world is different, has different rules. Some are very based on logic, some are very absurd and just out there worlds, and they for some reason come back to reality. They do not adjust, and they're whisked off by this lady to her boarding school made for children that traveled to these other worlds. Each book is a companion, and in this one, which I think is installment number 4, I think this is number 4 or 5, I think 4. I think this is number 4, but it might be 5, but I think it's 4.
Eventually.
Anyway, let's go with 4. And this is the story of Landy. Landy, she kind of travels to this world, which is based on the Goblin Market, where basically everything you acquire in the Goblin Market you have kind of pay for, and you might be paying for by making tasks for somebody or giving some of your stuff away, and there is a very delicate balance. And I don't want to say anything else, otherwise it's a spoiler. I do remember Landy, that we met Landy in other books basically, but this is her story. So sometimes the story takes you forward to the point where you start in the first book, sometimes takes you backwards so you understand why the children came to the boarding school to begin with, which is the case with this. So this is a kind of prequel if you want. I think this was so weird, as all the series has been so far. So freaking weird. And I love their weirdness, and I love it's short, so I really read this very quickly. And I have to say though I didn't love this as much as others installment, for example the third one I absolutely loved, and even the first one I really enjoyed. This was a tiny bit less in my taste. I was just a tiny bit less interested, but overall it's still a 3.5 stars. I love the series in general, and I continue on with it. Then for my TBR jar, so a book that I picked from my jar up there, you cannot see, but it's there. It's a random book from my shelves basically. I've read The Science of Game of Thrones by Helen Keane. This is a non-fiction where basically she takes some elements of Game of Thrones, the series and the book, and kind of explains she doesn't really explains actually the science behind those things. She takes ideas from Game of Thrones to then explain to us some weird science of possibly related things. Sometimes it's a bit far-fetched. I really enjoyed this overall though. It was very hilarious. I really enjoyed the way she was writing this. And I think it's, again, a bit far-fetched sometimes. Like, it's just general ideas that she kind of then modify and discuss them. So I think she had some topics she wanted to discuss, and then she kind of linked them somehow to Game of Thrones elements. But it was interesting. I learned a lot of science-y things that I didn't know, and a lot of things about animals that I didn't know. And I love animals. I love documentaries. And this was kind of sometimes felt like watching a documentary. It was really interesting. Some very weird as F facts about animals that I loved learning about. And the last book that I've actually finished in February was In the Miso Soup, Ryu Murakami. This is the Japanese horror pick for the month. And this is the story of Kenji. Kenji is a red light district guide for tourists, and so basically takes tourists or people who hire him in general, I think, around the red districts of Tokyo, showing them the clubs and, you know, where to get sex and all of that basically. And he's hired by this American tourist called Frank. He's middle-aged and he goes to Tokyo just to have fun basically at night. Pretty soon Kenji kind of feels that Frank is up to no good, and Frank is a very weird character. He might be potentially very dangerous, and his mind might be very, very deviant. So I'll just leave it at that. This is quite short, although I have to say that for how short this is, it took me ages to read. Like, it's very densely written. I did struggle. I don't know if it was the translation that wasn't perfect, but this is the book that I enjoyed the least in all the months reading. This is the only 2 stars. I don't know, I just don't enjoy the writing. I think I understand, like, I wasn't even offended for the terminology that were used, because when I read a horror like this, I understand why sometimes terms or misogyny that I would definitely be irked about in other contexts, in this context, and I might understand why it's used. However, it's just the story, I didn't like it. This is described as one of the grossest books that you can ever read, and maybe because I've done a challenge where we read the 10 most disturbing books ever written, which I'll link it up here and down below. Maybe because I've done that challenge, I didn't find this particularly disgusting. It was gross in a couple of places, but it's more about walking around and talking and speculating about this man mostly. So the action is very, very little. Actually, I'd say like 1 or 2 scenes, and all the rest is just bunch of information. Some might call philosophical discussions about deviancy, and this man explaining to us why he is the way he is and his story. And as someone who actually studied these things, some of the things just didn't make sense. Like, it was not well done in that sense, and that's why probably I didn't click with it. Like, I was like, no, that doesn't make sense. Or like, yes, you took a theory that might work, but then you twist it in a way that now just doesn't add up. Struggled through this, took me ages to read this short thing, didn't find it particularly interesting. It was gross in a couple of places, but nothing that really shocked me. Like, I wasn't betrayed, completely chilled while reading this. And lastly, I would say it felt incomplete, and I was kind of wishing for a twist. I was imagining this twist happening. I was like, oh, I think I know the twist, and then it never happened. But I think the twist would have made this so much better, and instead there was no twist. So yeah, no, disappointing so far. Also definitely not my writing style, but it might be the translation. So that was it for this month. That's all I've read. Yeah, a bit disappointing. I hope that one of this month I can kind of finish my 10 books TBR. Finger crossed. But thank you for watching, guys. Take care. I'll see you next time. Ciao!